Hi, everyone. I'm here with Marcel Lamont Walker, who is an award-winning graphic prose creator and expert in social applications for comic book art. He is the lead artist, book designer, and project coordinator for the acclaimed comic book series Chutzpah, Superheroes of the Holocaust, published by the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. He is also the president of the board of directors for the Toonseum, Pittsburgh Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art. It's a pleasure to talk to you, Marcel. How you doing?
I'm okay. How are you, Anjali?
Good. It's nice to be talking to friends. I have seen your Chutzpah publication, the one that you put out recently, and it is phenomenal.
Oh, thank you.
I was floored by it. It's so inspiring. Were you commissioned by the Holocaust Center to create that?
No. So the way my history with the Holocaust Center works is the Chutzpah project was kicked off in late 2013, and when it was started, they weren't even sure that they hadn't had plans at that point to make a comic book, but there was talk of utilizing comics art in reframing Holocaust education narratives. Because prior to that, most Holocaust education centered on in describing the experiences of those who lived through it or endured it. It focused on them typically as victims. And I wasn't involved with the project. I should also point that out at the very beginning. I knew about it shortly afterwards, but I wasn't actually involved at that point. But the goal was to restructure Holocaust narratives in education to view and talk about survivors and participants as heroes. So that was the guiding mission of the project from day one. So in short order, a committee was convened. It included some notable people from the Holocaust Center and from the Toonseum. And because I was plugged into the Toonseum at that point, I was aware of the project in its early stages. And then when they decided they wanted to actually make a comic, they reached out and they brought in some local artists, and I was on the short list of artists that they brought in. And I was very aware of what they were doing, and just my role expanded pretty rapidly. And then you jump forward in time, we did the first issue, and that came out in August of 2014. And then a couple years later, we did the second issue, volume, we call them. And then between volume 2 and 3, the center actually realized the value of having somebody on staff who was familiar with the project. So they actually created a role for me. So my official title at the Holocaust Center is the Chutzpah, name of our comic, Chutzpah Project Coordinator. And so it's my job to kind of manage the project. And my role has expanded since I've been there too. Comics is a really big world, and when you start introducing comics into the world of social justice, social representation, civic learning, it's pretty heady space. So Chutzpah's grown, my role with the project's grown, and it's really nice knowing that it's getting out there and the people like you are seeing it and that it's affecting lives positively. So it's good. It's good. I'm happy with it all.
It's really cool that one of the publications focuses on women heroes of the Holocaust.
Yes, it is. Every issue is thematic, and it was that way from the beginning. Volume 1, in retrospect, Volume 1 acts as kind of a primer for the series in that it reflects some stories that focus on different themes that we would then focus on more directly. So it's kind of got a cross-section of experiences. Volume and everybody profiled in Volume 1, ultimately they are all survivors who came and settled here in Pittsburgh. So that's what it had really in common. And then Volume 2, we focused on what we call international heroes. So these are predominantly people with larger profiles, larger international profiles, mostly from the European theater. Volume 3, we brought it back to Pittsburgh, and we focused on people who had been children and you're very young during the Holocaust. So we call that volume The Young Survivors. And in our current volume that has just been completed, we had an advanced version that came out at the beginning of the year, but like literally within the past couple of weeks, we got volume 4 back from the printer and everything, with everything finalized. It took some time to pull it together, but we did it. And yes, it focuses on women's stories because there are specifics of women's stories that needed to be explored. And we're fond of saying anytime we're talking about survivor narratives, I think it just applies to kind of the world at large, that anytime you hear one survivor's story, you're hearing one survivor's story. So even though there may be overlap in terms of certain experiences, places where numerous people were at, or certain things that happen to a lot of people, each person's experience is unique to them. So we try to keep that in mind, but we also try to select stories in each volume, because each issue is an anthology. And we try to select stories that represent kind of a breadth of experiences. So there's the through line in Volume 4 of these being women's experiences and the resilience that they needed in order to endure what they did. Often a lot of these elements were very specific to them because of gender roles. But there are also things that are specific to them just because individuals and people. And it's important for us to remember that, women are people too, and they have very, very specific experiences. So, yeah, I love how every issue of Chutzpah, it just becomes better and better. Even sometimes when we're in the middle of producing it, it can have its stressors, but without fail, every issue has really kind of exceeded our expectations, and the series as a whole, I feel, just gets better and better. And it started pretty strong, so I'm very happy with, where we're at right now.
Well, you're using the word narrative. I don't know much about comics. I've maybe read a few, and they're very interesting, and they can be very involved. But it is storytelling. Like, what elements are there involved?
Oh boy. Well,
technical, but
no. Well, so in terms of making comics, I always knew all along that I wanted to make comics. So this is from almost the moment I was exposed to them, and that's when I was like 6. And my father, I swear this all pertains, my father was a visual artist. He did a lot of visual art, not necessarily professionally, but he was very talented, and that was part of, I think, what made me just have that desire early on to want to do this. Is like I could see somebody who could make this kind of thing, and I just it was always attainable in that regard to me. And I knew other really creative people as we went along, and it was never some other thing. It was never like, it was always kind of magical, but it was never totally magical. It was like, it's a thing that human beings do, and I had some understanding of that early on. And because I was immersed so early, like, comics are just in my DNA, just like making comics and how they go and how to understand them and all the things, like, it's just in there. And I've also taught how to make comics for years. So, like, a lot of the mechanics of making comics, I just understand. So things that are specific to Chutzpah, though, so, you always have your stories, and stories have to have protagonists and antagonists, and they have arcs, they have a beginning and a middle and an end, and ideally they should have something that they are about, and somebody is pursuing something during the course of this story. And maybe somebody's pursuing something opposite to that, or trying to stop that thing in that story. Like, those are things that applies in any kind of narrative, really. But comics narrative, I often say the thing that makes it unique is its depiction of time. A couple things that make it unique. One is its depiction of time, because it is not a contiguous thing. A reader's relationship with time in comics depends on how a reader reads and engages with the material. So it's not a passive medium. It's an active medium. A reader has to be actively engaged with comics. And I've noticed that comics are, as a medium, that's one of its core strengths. It is an engaging medium. People have a hard time not noticing or paying attention to comics. Whether they actually follow through and read them or not, that's a whole other thing, but it's hard to turn away from comics imagery. it's very primal, and it's very primal because it's engaging two parts of your brain. It's engaging the part that engages with literature, so the written word, and then it's engaging the part that engages with visuals. And you combine those two in one format, and you got comics. And so you get to play to like dual strengths of a reader's brain. That's powerful stuff. I'll point out, when we were starting the project, some of our survivors that we approached to be in it, and I wasn't involved with this part of it, but I was aware that this had happened. You know, not all the survivors were on board with the creation of Hutzpah, because the conception they had of the project was that it was a comical thing. You know, even from its name, comic books, and unfortunately, it still lingers, that perception of comics as a comical thing. So, but fortunately, they were willing to trust the center and trust the intentions of what we were trying to do, and we very, very, very quickly won them over. Like, once they saw the final product and saw what we were aiming to do, they were all on board. If anything, it actually flipped the script completely, because then they went from being, you know, having reservations about it to wanting to be in it, like, a lot, and which was really flattering. It's a little daunting, though, because space in Hutzpah is very limited. You know, we usually have between 4 and 6 stories per issue, typically. So we have to be very specific about the stories we tell. So there's a narrative within a story, within a person's story, and we try to focus on the experiences that really transcend and make their experiences the most unique, and like the moments and the times, like what made this person this person. And you know, that takes a little bit of work. How do you pare a life down to 6 pages? It's very difficult. But then we also try to make each volume thematically sound. So we try to find a nice mix of stories that really explore the themes as wide as we can. You know, I know when we were working on the Young Survivors, you know, that had all the challenges, because we were talking about, you know, the breadth of children's experiences during World War II. So you have children who were hidden survivors, or hidden children. You had children who were visibly hidden, you know, who blended in as non-Jewish. You had children who were in like ghettos and camps, and then you had children who were refugees who went to other countries. So you have all these different experiences, and you want to choose stories that reflect all those different narrative experiences. There's this like overarching thing. We often like to say that we're using the micro histories of the individuals to stitch together a larger macro history of the Holocaust experiences. And I think that's the best way to look at it.
Well, that's what I was just thinking. Like, we call them comics, but it seems like the stories are not always funny. They encompass a wide variety of types of stories. And you're also called a graphic prose artist. I think, is that term graphic prose taken on more and more of a importance?
Well, and to give credit where credit is due, I have a friend, her name is Jamie Marlowe, and I will give her a shout out right there, because she's the first one that used it with me. She was helping me with a project, and she used that term, and I realized how much I loved that term. You know, what it does is, I feel it gets to the heart of what we're dealing with. When we talk about comic books and all aspects of, I'm going to say, comic book culture, because comic book culture, you can think of it like an umbrella, and there's all these things underneath it. And I've been devoting a lot of thought to some of this here recently too. Underneath that umbrella of comic book culture, you have comics fandom and advocates, and then you have comics academia, and then you have comics retail, and then you have comics publishing. But the one that, you know, we're delving into right now is comics creation. You know, and I'm a comics creator. So you got all these things up under comics, but comic books are not really, they're not a genre. They often get referred to as a genre, but they're not really a genre. It's a medium. You know, it's a means of communicating with somebody else. So in trying to make that distinction between the creation of the art and the medium with which it's distributed by, I started referring to it as graphic prose, the art form, because it's the difference between having, a glass of water, having water in a glass, and you say, if you were to ask somebody, hey, could you get me some water? I might hand somebody, and I did not have these props to plan this, but I use this analogy all the time. So if you said to somebody, hey, could I have some water, and they hand you water in a glass, well, the water is the water, and the glass is the container, but you might say to somebody, hey, or that person might bring you water in a bottle. They still brought you water, but the container is different. So when I say graphic prose, that's to get us away from being fixated on the container, because the label that we applied to that container so long ago, comic books, is really a misapplication. Now, there's historical reasons why that was what they were called, but most comics are not comical. Some are, but most of them actually are not, and they're not strictly books by definition. They'd be closer to magazines or even newspapers in terms of their, like, how they are published. So by referring to what I do in creation of the work as graphic prose, that gets us out of that, because graphic prose, the art form, the water, can be expressed in all kinds of media. Graphic prose can be found in comic books. It can be found in comic strips, like in newspapers or periodicals and things. It can be found in web comics. You can have political cartoons. There's comics journalism. So there's all these different expressions of graphic prose, the art form, within different media, and that's why I use that. But that also is kind of my hoity-toity way of just saying, like, this is a real thing, and I take it seriously, and you should take it seriously too. But you should have fun. So I'm not so hung up on it. If somebody says, Marcel, you make comics, I'm like, yeah, I make comic books. That's what I do. It's my stock and trade. So I can use it interchangeably, mostly as a means of language, like meet people where they're at. But yeah, I like graphic prose. Like, I've been using that a lot. I use it in different forms and things, and people, it's nice because there was a time when I was using it where I had to explain it even more. Now people just roll with it. They just kind of get it, and I love that. It's like, I think people just understand what it's about. So, when I'm talking about something like Chutzpah, it's nice because Chutzpah is for real, and Chutzpah is no joke, and I don't want people to perceive it that way at all. It's engaging, but it's meant to be taken seriously, because these are people's lives, and these are experiences that are meant to inform our experiences now. So yeah, I think it deserves to be, applied with a label that has a little bit more heft to it. So yeah, graphic prose, that's my term of choice.
It's like an expression of a story. You're expressing a narrative. That's what we do in dance.
Exactly.
Even in Indian classical dance, we are expressing the mythological stories, and there's always a climax, like you were saying, a beginning, a middle, and an end. In India too, there's such a history of having these, comic books, which tell the stories of Hindu gods and goddesses. I have a whole bunch downstairs in the garage. It's like a written play, even.
Sure.
Like you said, it's just a medium through which the story is told. How sensitive was the process in working with the Holocaust survivors in creating the Chutzpah publication? Was it like something you've never done before?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Chutzpah is definitely unique in my professional experience. I've never worked quite so intimately with subjects, and I've never had to document anything quite so substantial or substantive. I've worked with real people before. Matter of fact, like, some of my previous projects included, like, I often have gotten commissions for drawing people as superheroes. That's a big deal. I've gotten that for years, and I really have enjoyed it. Sometimes it's, people commissioning me to draw a loved one or whoever as a specific superhero, but more often than not, I was invited to kind of create characters of people as people. So that involved it involved looking at people in a different way, kind of like looking at them to kind of find the extra special, the meta special, the superheroic, and how do you reflect that graphically? How do you render that? And so you take it up a level. I created my own comic book years ago called Hero Core, and Hero Core is literally, it was my first formal foray into superhero storytelling, because I realized over the years, as much as I read superheroes and advocated for them and all that kind of thing, I've never actually made a superhero comic. So I made one of my own, and the premise of Hero Core is it's superheroes more or less in the real world. It was set here in Pittsburgh, and I called it New Pittsburgh in the book. And all the main characters in the book were based on people who I was friends with and worked with. And that working with part was very by design, because in the comic, all the superheroes work for a company. So like if you became a superhero in that universe in New Pittsburgh, the expectation was like in the real world, if you display a certain talent, like let's say you're a great basketball player, like people just see you like, you're amazing, you should play for the Knicks one day, or you should play for the Lakers, like the expectation is you'll go to that level. So in the Hero Core universe, the expectation is, oh, look at your power, you should work for Hero Core. Oh, so that's actually the name of the company in the book. And then so I made myself in the book, and it was a neat experience doing that. I'm just kind of cutting to the chase with it, in that having the lead character in that, because my character is called the Pro in Hero Core, and having the Pro be a black person, I watched how that always connected with black audiences. Like when they saw my character on the cover, like they always noticed that. Which is fascinating to me, because again, comics are in my DNA, so I don't react the same way as like people on the outside do. But it was so personal to so many people, and I saw it happen, and it happened quickly because comics are engaging. So by the time I was asked to participate in Hutzpah, I had worked with real life subjects and transferred them into the comics medium, but I'd never actually had to tell their story in that way. Like all my people who I'd done this with before had given me a lot of latitude with my stories. But when you're dealing with like matters of historical record and historical recollection, and then you're also dealing with the people, like they are there, and they will tell you if you got some details wrong or whatever, that's a whole other level of responsibility. I was at my drawing table one night working on the first issue, like directly across the hall, and I was drawing a particular page in a particular survivor's story, and I was up late that evening. I was, working, just putting in some burning midnight oil, working on it, and it hit me, this particular moment that I was depicting, that this was real. Like, this actually happened to somebody 70 years ago, nearly 80 years ago. Like, this actually happened to somebody, and it was my job to preserve that moment. For people who might not otherwise come across this story, which that survivor had told, but, like, there's so many people who would not have come across it except for this. And I was in the middle of inking that page, and when that hit me, that realization hit me, I paused, and like my hands started to shake. I actually had to stop and kind of just sort of recenter before I could go back and do it. I'd never had that happen before, but it was like, it was the enormity of the moment. It really came across. And I would guess that most of the creators who have worked on the series, because again, it's not the Marcel show. It's a number of creators who have worked on Hutzpah since its inception. I would bet most of them have had some kind of moment like that that's similar, where, they recognize, like, this is the importance of it. And it might not come until after the books are done. Like, sometimes you don't really get that until you have a little bit of time to step back and be a little bit more objective and see the final thing. You see the final thing in context with these other stories, or even see the reaction that it gets from the audience and sometimes the survivors themselves. I got to witness something really lovely when we did the third issue. I guess this probably answers your question more directly than any of this other stuff I've mentioned, but Volume 3 was the one that told the stories of our young survivors. So my teammates at the Holocaust Center, we had an event with some of the survivors here at the JCC in Squirrel Hill. And as it happened, JCC was unveiling an original exhibit where we had original art from that volume up on the walls. So we were letting them know that the book was done, and we had this art out on the hallway. And one of the survivors whose story we had in there took another survivor out into the hall with them to show him his story. And so I watched as this one survivor was just like showing his story to this other survivor. And I heard him say, because the story focuses heavily on that survivor's mother, and I heard him say, as he was gesturing to the artwork, "That's my mom." And I got to tell you, just like, it gets me now, like even now I just got kind of a chill remembering that, because it was just so powerful that we were able to preserve their stories that way. You know, like who gets that opportunity? You know, what's the big line that kind of closes out Hamilton? You know, they talk about who lives, who dies, who tells your stories. Like, we get to tell their stories. You know, and that's a responsibility and a blessing and an honor. So it's yeah. I think a lot of this project.
I think that what you're doing is, I mean, it's valueless, it's priceless. I mean, how do you even verbalize the impact that you're having with this? The one publication with the superheroes, the women, a lot of them were sports figures.
Volume 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, the main figure on here is Margaret Bergman, who had been scheduled to, well, she had earned the right to compete in the 1936 Olympics. Oh my gosh, you would think that I would know this by heart now, because I've been doing this forever. And I look it up as I'm talking. Should have on my glasses before I did this. In 1934, she won the high jump in the British Championships. So I guess it's the 1936 Olympics. Yeah, so this one, it took a while before I had the imagery for the covers. Covers are generally a challenge. I've done the covers for all 4 issues, and they can be a challenge, you know, picking an image that represents your broad theme. Volume 1 and Volume 2, the cover art on both of those stories is based on some classic superhero covers. Like, they actually, like, that was by design. Volume 3 is the one that came to me the easiest, and that one we opted to not pick any one person's story to show any of the actual survivors on the cover. So it's more representative of, it's more thematic in its approach. Volume 4, though, we went back to depicting the survivors who are featured in the issue, but for the longest time I could not come up with the approach for that cover. Which story, like what moment do I use and which story works? And then I remember I was actually in a staff meeting, and, you know, that's how you know, as any creative knows, like sometimes your best ideas come to you in the oddest of places. I often get great ideas while I'm washing dishes, of all things. It's like my Zen space where I can Zen space out. So I don't know, maybe I was spacing out during the staff meeting. I don't think so. Make sure my director knows. No, I wasn't. I was paying so much attention. I was obviously in the zone, and but it just came to me. And you know what? I joke about that, but it's entirely possible somebody in the meeting said something that triggered the thing, and I realized, oh, I know what the cover needs to be. And it was the image of Margaret Bergman. She was not a pole vaulter. She was a high jumper. So she was doing the high jump. I realized, oh, that's it, isn't it? That's our metaphor. That's everything. So it just worked super perfectly. And, you know, what's nice in that issue, too, is by having this breadth of experience, like what made it kind of difficult coming up with an image that represented the volume, you know, this wide breadth of experiences. You know, do I go with the athlete? Do I go with the spy? Do I go with the person who became a world famous actress? Do I go with the person who assumed a male identity to go into high? Like, who do I choose? But that's its strength, like it's all of these and more. And so like they're all on the cover. I made sure they're all depicted, but like the imagery of a strong woman overcoming a really tall hurdle. I'm like, oh, that's it, isn't it? That's what that has to be. So yeah, and once I knew that, and then it was like a done deal.
Well, you also work with the Toonseum.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you guys located?
We're located in everyone's hearts now. So for years the Toonseum was located in downtown Pittsburgh on Liberty Avenue in the heart of the Cultural District. It was originally founded over at the Children's Museum on the north side. It was founded by Joe Woes, local comics creator, and Joe was the founder, and he started the Toonseum off at the Children's Museum within a couple of years, and so that was back in, I want to say 2008 or 2009. I have the official written history somewhere, but that works. But within a couple of years, the Toonseum was able to move downtown and moved into its space in the Cultural District, and it was there for quite some time. It was there for about 8 or 9 years, and a lot of programming took place there. A lot of gallery exhibits of note, and we hosted a lot of project partners and things. It was a lot of workshops were hosted there. I taught a lot of workshops through there, and Hoodspal began its life as a partnership with the Holocaust Center and the Toonseum. So and like I said, so one led directly to the other for me. So I have a lot of affection with both. So about 4 years ago, I was asked to join the board of directors at the Toonseum, and I originally joined with in my mind, my goal was to be essentially an artist liaison. I felt like it needed more of that presence on the board with our local comics community. So this would have been, again, fallen under the creator part of all that under the umbrella. There was a lot of just turnover. We had people who cycled off, and things changed. But also, we ultimately decided to let go of the space downtown because it just was a little cost prohibitive for us to continue with that. And while that might have seemed drastic to some, I guarantee, like once this pandemic rolled around earlier this year, and it was clear that had, even though we did it considerably before this happened, it's been over a couple of years now, I think, since we left that space. But we would not have survived the pandemic in the space that we were in, just like with the costs that were associated with it. Toonseum would have been a casualty of the pandemic. So it's good that we weren't there. Now we've partnered with some other agencies and organizations. We've been running some workshops with and at the Sarah Hines House over on the north side, and that's been a great partnership. We are also currently hosting another workshop with them. We're also hosting a workshop with Right Pittsburgh, and both are very youth centric, and it's great. Like we haven't been able to engage in as much programming as we did in the past. We're still trying to find our footing. We're right now in the middle of another recruitment drive. We're looking for new board members. So if there's anybody out there who might have a special skill or talent or connections and things, if you think you might be a good fit, reach out to us, because we are trying to expand our board, and we are being very intentional about the direction in which we expand it. We are looking purposely to be more inclusive. These words get used a lot now, but they should get used a lot now. And when I joined the board, there was an understanding that it needed to become a little less, I'll say, monochromatic. And so now we are still collectively working towards that goal. We've done pretty well, but we've had some ups and downs, and there's still some challenges with that. But it's very important, and I recognize my role now. So I've been board president, like I said, for about 2 years now, about two and a half, and it is important for people of color to occupy leadership roles in the arts and in nonprofits and in arts-based nonprofits, and it's important for us to acknowledge that and to get support where we need it. So, you know, and to find and build that support. Unfortunately, we've been very blessed. You know, we hoping to be even more blessed, but we've been blessed, and you know, we've had assistance from the Heinz Foundation, and they were very good with us and kind of rooting us on, and you know, we hope to have even more support. So yeah, there's a lot entailed with that. You know, as a board member, I'm a volunteer, so it's, you know, I'm not paid. Aside from there's certain things I get paid for that like professionally I would have to be paid for, but it's minimal, you know. But it's okay. The goal there is to build the comics community out, and you know, I would love to see me as a black person making comics in this country, in this city. I would love to see that becoming less of a novelty.
The Write Pittsburgh organization works with girls and helping them write their stories.
We have opened that up to, so the workshop was open to, I believe, boys and girls, but it's all girls in that one. It's a small group right now, but they're in, you know, and so right now the big difference between our Sarah Hines workshop and our Write Pittsburgh workshop is the Sarah Hines House workshop is in person right now, mostly. Like it's like a hybrid, but it's mostly in person. Most of the kids that are attending that are in the physical space, and I'm in the physical space there with them. The Write Pittsburgh workshop is being done remotely, and it is a different world. Like learning the difference between the two. Like how do educators acclimate themselves to those spaces? My esteem for educators who have had to navigate the territory they have for the last year or so has just risen dramatically, and I'm already impressed with what they've had to do. But like once you've been doing something similar to that, you really realize the challenges that they face and the challenges that are faced on both ends. You know, there's challenges with technology, access to, acumen with, all that. You know, all those things, all those variables, they play a significant role. And we're trying to make engagement with comics translate into this new world space. So far, it's been pretty good. Now we'll see in the weeks to come how it plays out, and hopefully it continues to be fine. But this is still an exploratory period. You know, we're still, so much like the Toonseum is trying to find its footing overall. I think we're all of us trying to find our footing in the world where we're at right now and still be able to meet people's needs, particularly youth. But, you know, with the understanding, like, this is not how we normally have done things. And when it's all said and done, we will have this experience to draw upon. So I don't know if we're going to completely go back to the old ways that we did things. Probably not. You know, there will be adjustments, and hopefully they'll be for the better.
So you were a museum.
Well, yes, it was a gallery. The emphasis had been on the Toonseum as a gallery space, whereas now our tagline is, you know, the Toonseum, where we emphasize comics as a force for social good. So it's not, we don't have a physical gallery space now. At some point, we would like to have that again, as well as space where we can actually engage and host comics workshops on site. But now we're focusing on the social applications of comics more than anything else, and the engagement with that. We had a program called our Comic Book Drop-Off that we ran a few months ago, and that was really successful. And we did that right in the thick of, the pandemic in the summer, and we realized that parents were looking for ways to keep their kids engaged and entertained and educated, and comics fit that role perfectly. And we were able to distribute comics to kids across, I forget the exact count, but I think it was like 40 neighborhoods across the region. And that's probably I'm almost certain that's the largest reach that the Toonzine has had with any of its programming to date.
You mean 40 neighborhoods in Pittsburgh?
Mm-hmm. Across
Wow.
the Pittsburgh region.
That's
and that was for just the first time out with the program. It took some hustle, but we were able to do it, and it was nice. It was a nice feeling. We had support from New Dimension Comics. They came through and helped provide us with some materials. Our board came together, our board and volunteers and staff. Like, everybody played a role in putting that together and distributing them and tracking everything. It's a lovely program that we intend to revisit, because there's nothing better than getting comics into the hands of new readers. That's another aspect. Like I said, underneath that umbrella, there's readers and advocates, and we want to always be bringing in new readers, because then readers transition into those other roles, academics and retailers and publishers and creators. But it starts with the readership. Like, you got to have people reading the comics. So yeah, I'm very proud of how that went.
You are working on expanding the social applications.
Uh-huh.
You talked earlier about social justice.
Comics have been engaged in matters of social justice since their inception. This is nothing new. That's the thing. It's nothing new. We think of superheroes predominantly with comics because comics' first breakout character was Superman. And so, that's a superhero. And so superheroes have become predominant in comics, but not exclusively. In comics' heyday, in terms of sales and general popularity, and this is back in the 1940s and into the 50s, where comics routinely sold millions of copies per issue. At that point, at its healthiest, comics had everything in it. That you had superheroes, but you had romance comics, and you had comedic comics. You had war and military themed comics. You had everything. And that's comics have gotten back to that place. Because if you visit a comic shop now, or go online and look at where comics are made available, go to a library and look for comics. They're all over the place. Like, in terms of subject matter, it's everything. It's not just superheroes, but superheroes tend to linger in the mind as the most important, most prevalent art genre in comics. And superheroes early on were engaged in what we now call social justice. Before it would have been civil action and civil rights and things. There's the infamous cover of Captain America punching out Hitler, and that was published before we were formally engaged as a country in World War II. Because you also had a number of Jewish creators, and they knew what the score was overseas. They knew what was happening. They had a direct pipeline to all of that. So you had that, but you had Superman dealing with domestic issues as well. And like work reform and all sorts of domestic issues. So this is nothing new. What I consider to be the single most important comic book ever published is called Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery Story. Now, that was published in the mid-50s, and it served two purposes. It detailed the experience of Martin Luther King in Montgomery, Alabama during the Montgomery bus boycott, what led up to that, what happened as a result, how the participants were able to engage in that. But it also served as a primer for those who wanted to get involved in the civil rights movement. That was a comic book that was actively created. Like, its creation saved lives, because it talked about what to do if you were involved in that movement, like what to physically do to keep yourself safe, and how to engage, the reasons for it. Like, that comic book saved lives. It also inspired people. Congressman John Lewis, the late Representative John Lewis, went on record with saying that that comic book changed his life. You know, that helped solidify what he wanted to do in terms of the civil rights movement at that time. You know, and he got his copy directly from Martin Luther King Jr. Now, that's crazy, but it's amazing. And you know, so comics have always occupied that social reform space. And like they've always, and even in just in a general sense, if you read most comics, they skew towards the good and prompting the best in their readership. Now, they're not perfect. No medium is perfect. Comics have a lot that they, you know, historically need to atone for. You know, they have not always been kind to women. They have not been kind to people of color. And there's a lot that needs to be addressed there, amongst other things. You know, the majority of comics heroes have been cis white men, and that's just a fact. So but in more recent years, and I say more recent years, and really you could see the progression charted across decades, the face of comics protagonists and subjects have changed, and that is changing, and it needs to keep evolving and changing. Because, you know, America's always been, you know, multi-chromatic, and that's the way our stories. The more we have of that in our fictions, the more that's going to reflect our realities and our facts. So, you know, comics as a force for social good is nothing new. They've always been that, but now we're just going to address that overtly. And when I talk about how the Montgomery story saved lives and made lives better, you know, that is continued. And you know, there's the March graphic novel series that actually details John Lewis's experience, and the Montgomery story intersects with that because they talk about that directly in the first volume of March. March is doing much the same work that the Montgomery story comic did. You know, it's showing you the inner workings of a movement, and that's vitally important. Like, you need that background if you are going to try and engage with that work and understand what went into that kind of work. And if I may be so bold, I think that Hutzpah is attempting to, I know it's attempting to do that work, and I hope it does, because it's meant to be, it's not just meant to be like this historical thing where you read it and now you know about this thing that happened in the past. I would say Hutzpah is meant to be an instructional comic. You know, it is meant to give you guidance for how to live in the world right now. Maybe not as directly as the Montgomery story, but in terms of ethics, absolutely. You know, ethically, it should help you become strong and know where your priorities need to be and know what you need to be focused on in the real world to avoid atrocities like that, big and small. So, yeah, the capacity for comics to stand for social good, and you know, that's been inherent there all along. So now, but being able to acknowledge it more overtly means we can tackle more subject matter more overtly in our comics. We don't need the metaphor of superhero all the time. We can just address the actual topic now.
So, like with ethics, has that always been a theme
in comics?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, when you look, I think it's always been there. I think it's been there since its inception. Some of our more popular characters, like Superman and Batman, amongst others, you know, the original Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman, like some of these characters were much rougher around the edges when they were first created. And that's true of any characters that are around for a long time. I mean, you figure those characters have been around 80-some years, and then you've got characters, even characters that historically are newer, like the main Marvel stable. Those characters have been around like 60 years. They've been around a long time, but almost encoded in their DNA from the beginning, so many of these characters had non-kill, like personal non-kill policies. Like, superheroes didn't kill. By and large, they did not kill. And overtly, that became like part of some of their personal codes. You know, Superman was known and Batman, like, they were known for having these personal codes they will not kill. Now, that's particularly notable, I think, with a character like Superman, who could do anything and then nobody's going to stop them. But the fact that it was decided that this character would not kill, I think right there you're talking about ethics, because the audiences that encounter those characters are going to start, hopefully, the goal is to get them to take those positions on themselves, you know. So, yeah, their moral imperative, their ethical imperative has been there since day one, or at least since day two. You know, once their power, I think, was discovered, people were able to implement it. You know, Superman jumped mediums pretty quickly. Within a couple of years, he was all over the place. He was in animated cartoons, in movie theaters. He was on radio. He was all over the place. And it was on that radio series where Superman actively took on the Ku Klux Klan. And that's a notable story, which just recently it was that the radio story was adapted into a modern comics series, which is now, I believe, you can get in trade paperback already. And a lot of the information that was put into that story originally was given to the writers directly from somebody who had infiltrated the real-life Ku Klux Klan. So, like, he infiltrated them, got information about their inner workings, filtered it through to the writers, and the writers put it into the radio series. So in doing so, they demystified the Klan, and they showed them to be ridiculous in their motivations and the way they went about it. And it depowered them, and it stigmatized membership in the Klan. They saw their membership numbers drop in our real world. So we're talking about comics having a real-world effect, and Superman making a change just by virtue of existing. There's other things that I could go into. I mean, there's numerous examples of this, but I think that's important to note. Like, again, when we're talking about the moral and ethical imperative of comics and the characters that have grown from comics, that were created from and, you know, made their way into the world, we see they've been affecting our real world longer than most of us have been alive right now. You know, like that power is already inherent there. It's just a matter of tapping into it. And so, you know, that's what we're doing. You know, that's what the intent of Hutzpah is, like, considering that ethical imperative, you know, and being able to impart that. I actually got kind of emotional recently when I was talking about this, and I realized for the first time, like, where it really, really hit me in the middle of saying it, I was talking about John Lewis, who I had the opportunity to meet a few years ago. He came to visit Pittsburgh and through a program at the Toonseum.
Wow.
And I was asked to, like, help sort of chaperone him for a little bit, and it was an amazing experience. You know, just like spending an hour or two with him and the creators of the March graphic novel. And I was talking about how the Montgomery story changed John Lewis's life. And he said that to me and the others in the room at the time. Like, he said that. So, you know, a comic book changed his life. And you figure the March comic book series, which tells his life, is probably doing the same thing out there. But in that same conversation, I was saying how it's possible that Hutzpah is doing something similar. And I realized that's the first time I really thought about it. Like, the idea that Hutzpah right now might be in the hands of someone out there who might be a future John Lewis, you know, who might be a vanguard for all that's good in our society. And that really got me, because that's a possibility. I don't know it for sure, but I suspect it's probably true. And, you know, there's no higher purpose than that. Inspiring somebody to that level of greatness, yeah, that's what I want to do.
Are you seeing any current trends?
There's trends all over the place. Like, there's trends creatively. There's trends, you know, like, again, if we think of that umbrella and all the different facts, you know, so you got fandom and advocates, you've got retail, you've got academics, you've got, whatever I said, I keep losing track of them. You got the creators, and you got publishers. And there's different trends amongst each of those areas. You know, the comics...
I've noticed creatively, like, things look different now.
They definitely do. Well, and
Yeah.
when comics started, I mean, it was a brand new medium, and like with most media, there were no real rules. So what you saw in terms of creators entering the field, you saw like a wide scale of talent. Like you had people who were so talented then. There are people now who are hard pressed to do what they did then. But you also had people who had very, just to be blunt about it, very crude skills. People
Mm-hmm.
who were able to find like substantive work in the industry back then that probably would not be able to work. Certainly not in mainstream comics. Almost anybody can still work in independent comics. I mean, that's the thing about comics. It doesn't take a whole lot to be in comics. I mean, you can if you pick up a pen or pencil and you get some blank paper and you start drawing and you find a way to copy that, and you're making comics. And it's just like the proportion, the scale to which you're doing it. But there were people who got into comics professionally back then who had really, by today's comparison, very rudimentary skills. That's changed over time, so nowadays you have to be working at a certain level just to get into mainstream comics. But comics, like, and one aspect under the umbrella will affect another. So, as comic sales have changed over the decades, that affects, the idea, like, who do you bring in? Like, you don't want, comics generally don't take chances, mainstream comics, on people with less polished skills. I guess that's the way to put it. So you got to enter into the industry with a level of talent that you didn't have to, and even in like the 70s into the 80s. I mean, you could get started with less polished skills. Now, not so much. Although now also you have more options in terms of independent comics, and people doing their own thing or finding companies, smaller companies that will publish and distribute their work. And that's just increasing. I think that's just going to continue to increase, and you're just going to see more variety with that. Now, you could say things about that, like, because you don't really have the same kind of quality control when anybody can kind of do their thing. At the same time, you got the freedom of people just doing what they want. And I think people find the good stuff that they need to find, that they want to find. Also, just as importantly, is you're seeing all kinds of people make comics from all kinds of backgrounds. That's the big revelation, because when comics were housed under, I guess, the equivalent of a two-party system, you had these two big monolithic companies, and they had all these characters in it. And, growing up, I was wondering, like, are you a DC kid or are you a Marvel kid? And that's still a question, but I think it's become far, far less of a thing now. I mean, because I always read everything. I mean, I didn't just read DC and Marvel. I was reading Archie comics. I was reading Harvey comics and things like Richie Rich and all that. I was reading Charlton comics. I read First comics and oh my God, and Eclipse comics. Like, there's all these, so I was reading everything in all the genres. But the expansion of just more, you got more people of color. You got far more women working mainstream comics. I should point out, people of color and women have always been making comics. So like, it's nothing new, but their roles are more expansive and their profiles are larger. That's good. That's a good thing. But there's so many other things that it's important to have people from different backgrounds, like so many other backgrounds it's important to have in there, like the queer community, like them having more representation, and you have more representation in comics when there's representation behind the scenes. So when you have more queer identifying creators working in comics, you're going to see more of those characters in the work. And it all normalizes. I mean, that's the only way it works. That's the way it works with the Toonseum as an organization. It's the way it works with comics writ large. It's the way it works with society. The more different kinds of people you have involved with things, the more it's going to be the work itself, and the things are going to be for all people, and people are going to be involved and invested. So, the big, I don't want to say trend. Trend sounds like it's just like it's a thing. It comes, it goes. But the big expansion in comics, I think, it's in inclusion. And intentional and mindful inclusion and what that represents. So, yeah, that's because that's more than a trend. You know, that has to be the way things just need to be. So yeah, that's the thing I think we need to watch and encourage.
Well, thank you so much for talking today. This has been so awesome.
Hey, thank
So great
you
to
for
talk to
asking
an
me.
expert who knew that Pittsburgh has a museum of comic and cartoon art.
Well, now
So,
we know. Now some folks know. So come find us. We have an online presence. You know, we have our website. We're on social media. We're on Facebook and Twitter, and you can send us email and you can interact with us. And and we're also talking about having more online programming. So that's a thing to watch out for because we want to be able to navigate the space and stay in touch with our audience here, not just here but abroad. You know, the one nice thing about interacting in remote spaces is we can go anywhere you're at. So yeah, please find us. Let us know you're out there and tell us what you want us to provide for you.
wonderful. Well, thank you so much again. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Anjali. It's been an honor to be here. And anytime you want me to come back, I'll come back. I can always talk about comics.
Awesome. Awesome.